Miss Arrowette, you're muted again.
Oh no, what keeps happening? Hold on. Let me see if that works. It keeps muting me. So just let me know if that happens again. Thank you so much. All right, so we are covering our second two categories of fungi, protista, eukaryotes today. Now I'm all brain scrambled. All right, give me a minute here. Get my thoughts together. So we're covering the kingdoms of protists and fungi. These are both eukaryotic organisms. They can be microscopic, especially the kingdom of protists. Fungi, you guys probably already know. Those are going to be our mushrooms, molds, slime molds, things like that. But they are made of the eukaryotic cells, which are the more complicated cells, very similar to our cells. Our cells are eukaryotic cells as well. So yesterday and the day before, we talked about prokaryotes. And remember, the difference between the two is that prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. They're very simple inside. They don't have all those organelles. Eukaryotes, which we're talking about today, they are more complicated. They're the ones that have the mitochondria, the nucleus, the ribosomes, all that stuff is inside of these guys. So I can learn about the microscopic organisms living in my environment. And hopefully everybody got through the Labster yesterday. If you were not here, please make sure that you log into my.labster.com and do the one on bacterial shapes and motion. Because I will be entering those grades on Friday. So if you did not finish that, please make sure that you go in and finish that. The link is in your content folder in the bacteria section, which I think is 3.05, if I'm guessing correctly. It's somewhere around there. So what we're talking about first are the protists, and you'll hear them called different things. Protist, protista, but they're all kind of the same word. And so proteos comes from the Greek origin. And most science words are going to be either Latin or Greek in origin, because that's what the original scientists were. They were pretty much Latin and Greek. And so proteos means the very first. And so they believe that these were the first types of organisms to be produced. And they have this type of shape. Some of them, they will either live by themselves or in colonies. They have that flagellum on the outside, which is kind of like a little boat rotor, which kind of moves the boat around. So it'll move these organisms around because they are microscopic. If they're one cell small, this is the whole organism. So it's got to be able to get around in the environment that it's in. But it also has a nucleus. It's going to have, an eye spot, chloroplast, flagellum, vacuoles. So it has a lot of those membrane-bound organelles in it. So they're very simple eukaryotic organisms. They are not classified in plants, animals, or fungi. So when I say they're not classified as plants, how many of you guys learned in elementary school that kelp or seaweed was a plant? Give me a thumbs up if you learned that in elementary school. Anybody? Okay. So I got to twist that thinking. Seaweed is not a plant. Okay, seaweed is actually a protist, and they're a bunch of protists living in a colony together, which is what creates seaweed. So when you pick up a piece of seaweed, if you go to the beach, you're actually holding a whole colony of organisms. You're not holding just one plant. You're holding a whole colony of organisms because it's not a plant. All right, so these were first discovered with a true nucleus, so that's what makes them eukaryotic. Most of them live in water or damp environments. So how many of you guys like to go out in lakes and rivers or play in the creek out in the backyard? Anybody in here? I have a big creek in my backyard. I love to play in it. I'd love to go see what's living in there, all the little creepy crawlies. So there are protists living in that water. And that's why you can't just go to the creek and get water and drink it, because it'll make you sick. And it makes you sick because of the things that are living in it that you can't see, which would be some kinds of bacteria or some kinds of protists. Both of them are microscopic. You won't be able to see them. So comparing the two cells that we've discussed this week, this is going to be your bacteria and your archaea. They're going to have this prokaryotic shape. It's very simple inside, doesn't contain any organelles except for the ribosome, which is not membrane bound, and it just has the DNA floating around in cytoplasm. So very simple structure. Over here, this is what we're talking about today, which are the protists, which are eukaryotic cells. And so you can see how much more complicated it is. It has a lot more structures inside. You know, you've got your nucleus in here, which this is lacking over here. So that's what makes this a eukaryotic cell. This one happens to be photosynthetic. Does anybody remember what that means? Photosynthetic? Want to pick up the mic and tell us, or put it in the chat? What is photosynthetic? Photosynthesis. What does that mean?
Energy from the sun.
Sorry, that definitely went down the wrong pipe. Ethan, did you want to say what photosynthesis was? You can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I said it's energy derived from the sun.
Yes. So these are just like plants in the fact that they produce their own food through sunlight, through photosynthesis. So that in order to do that, they have to have a specific organelle. So who remembers what that organelle is called? Anybody remember? Well, it's a good thing we're going over plants again next week. Okay, so that organelle is called a chloroplast. So remember, the chloroplast is what makes the energy that organism is going to use using the sunlight to convert it into sugar. And so these guys are able to do that. And that's why a lot of people kind of confuse them with plants, is because they have the same abilities as plants. But these guys can be microscopic, or they can be living in colonies. They're not plants. They don't have any kind of vascular tissue or anything like that. So you'll see they do both have a flagellum. So that's one thing that is similar between the two of them, is that they have this little hair-like projections coming out. So when you take your test at the end of the semester, just don't forget that they both have these things. So if you see a cell that looks like this, you have to identify, does it have these organelles? Because if it has these organelles, then that means it's eukaryotic. If it doesn't have these organelles, that means that it's prokaryotic. Okay, so don't let this little flagellum on the end fool you. All right, key characteristics. They contain membrane-bound nucleus, so they have a nucleus. They're usually unicellular, meaning that they live on their own, but some are multicellular, like the one we're seeing here. They can be found in aquatic, moist environments, and they can be audiotrophic or they can be heterotrophic, because there's two totally different kinds. Okay, so there's the like the amoeba type ones that are more of a protozoa, which means animal-like. And then there's the plant-like ones, like seaweed. So if you look at this piece of seaweed right here, this is actually a whole bunch of different organisms living in a colony. This is just one single cell. You couldn't see this one with your own eyes. An amoeba you cannot see with your own eyes. They're microscopic. All right, so they have different ways that they can move. So they move with flagella, they move with cilia, And some have these things called pseudopodia, which means false feet. Again, that's going to be another Latin word. Pseudo means false, podia means feet. So pseudopodia means false feet. So if you look at this amoeba right here, it has these little structures right here, and they kind of act like feet for this unicellular organism, for this microscopic organism. So it can kind of walk around. It can capture things so that it can eat them using those pseudopodia. The other kind, your paramecium here, he has cilia on the outside of the cell. So these are little hair-like projections that kind of help it move around in the water. And then over here with our euglena, which is more of a plant-like one, you're going to have the chloroplast inside, and then you have this thing called a flagellum. Okay, so 3 different ways that these organisms can move around. Now, there's 3 different types, so remember this. Protozoa are the animal-like ones. Photosynthetic are the plant-like ones. They do photosynthesis, so they're plant-like. Plant-like because they're not plants. We just call them plant-like. And then there's what we call slime molds. That sounds like a fun one, right? These are fungus-like ones. So they're going to be growing on trees. They're going to look like a fungus, but they're not a true fungus. So that's why we call them fungus-like. So animal-like have the ability to move, have the ability to eat. Plant-like have the ability to create their own food. And then fungus-like are going to be decomposers. They're going to break down dead stuff. Sorry, my throat is killing me today. So you can see here that they take all different shapes. This one over here is a slime mold. This one over here is a protozoa. And this one over here is photosynthetic. This one over here would be photosynthetic. All right, so we have, they're unicellular. There are 4 major groups. Okay, so 4 major groups. Amoeboid is going to be your animal-like one that's going to go out and eat stuff. Flagellated is going to be ones that have the little strings coming off the edge. Ciliated is going to be the ones that have the little hair-like projections over here. And then sporozoans are going to be our fungus-like ones. Okay, they're like spores like you would find in a mushroom. Mushrooms have a lot of spores. So these are your 4 main groups of protozoa, which are the animal-like ones that are able to move. And that's why they call them animal-like. If they're able to move, and if they're able to produce their own food, they're able to eat other organisms, then they're considered animal-like. These are the slime molds. Anybody ever see any of these when you're walking around in your woods? Give me a thumbs up if you've seen something like this when you're walking around in the woods, or maybe just outside in the tree in your yard. Typically, you'll see this right here, and you'll not know what that is, but that is considered a fungus-like protist. It's a colony of organisms living together. They look like berries, but they're not berries. So they look like red berries, but they're actually just little tiny organisms growing out of the tree. And if you were to go and touch them, they would be kind of slimy. Okay, so they're definitely not berries. Don't eat them. All right, so these are saprophytic, which means that they can break down dead stuff. Okay, they're decomposers. So decomposers are one of our most important types of organisms on the planet. Because what do decomposers do? Does anybody know? Anybody want to pick up the mic and tell me, what do decomposers do?
Does it break down cells?
It does. It breaks down. Yep. Good, Juju. Good, Zia. Good, Ethan. It breaks down dead stuff. And so it'll break it down and it'll put all those nutrients from that organism back into the soil so that new plants can grow. And that's how we keep the planet going. Because if you think about it, if a plant grows in your yard, it's using up all the nutrients in that soil. So after that plant dies, if those nutrients were not replenished in the soil, you couldn't get a new one to grow, and we would be out of plants, which would be detrimental because they are the major part of our food chain. They produce 100% of the energy in our food chain. So these guys, even though they're super ugly and kind of gross, they are one of the most important organisms in your environment. So they feed on dead and decaying matter. They break it down. They put the nutrients back in the soil so that new plants can grow. They can have multiple nuclei. So they may not just have one brain in their cell. They can have multiple ones. And then they can form what are called visible aggregates, which is kind of like a colony, a group of these organisms living together. I would call this more of a colony, and I would call this more of an aggregate. This would probably be more of a colony. See how close together they are? See how close together they are here? That's more of a colony. Whereas here, they're kind of spread out a little bit. All right, then we have the plant-like ones. So these are going to be like your chrysophyta, which are your diatoms, dinoflagellates, which are very cool. They are bioluminescent. Does anybody know what that means? Bioluminescent? Yes, they glow. So if you're ever looking in the water in your creek or your lake or whatever, and you see something glowing in the water, it is not an extraterrestrial being. It is what we call bioluminescent diatoms. And that's typically, like if you went and got a pond sample and looked at it under a microscope, that's typically what you're going to find are diatoms. So they're bioluminescent. Those are called dinoflagellates. Then you have euglenoids, and these organisms can all produce oxygen because they're doing photosynthesis. They're creating glucose from the sunlight, and then as a byproduct, they're giving off oxygen. And so that's the oxygen that we breathe. So another reason why these organisms are so important, because you have zillions and zillions of these organisms on Earth producing oxygen for us. Give me a minute. I apologize, you guys. I have this autoimmune disease, and it makes me cough a lot. So you'll see that I'm constantly drinking all the time. Keep my throat from being too sore. Travis, did you have a question? Okay. All right. So we talked about them being bioluminescent. I did not, Travis. I'm trying to teach class right now, but I'll talk to you after class about it. All right. So these guys produce oxygen. They're bioluminescent. We talked about the fact that the ones that are bioluminescent are called dinoflagellates or chrysophytes. These are both going to be different forms of bioluminescent plant-like Protista. And remember, they're plant-like because they make food from sunlight. So these guys are the foundation of the food chain. They're kind of on the same level as you would consider plants. So plants, in case you didn't know, they produce 100% of the energy that we consume. So they're the most important. They supply all the animals that we eat, all the fruits, all the vegetables, all that kind of stuff. They are the bottom of the food chain. They're the most important structure, most important organism. If they get removed from the food chain, we go extinct. We would go extinct. They provide the oxygen that we need in order to breathe. And we talked about that when we talked about, deforestation before, where if they remove all of the trees, then we don't have trees making oxygen. The problem is not, they talk all about carbon, carbon footprint and this and that and burning fossil fuels. But the fact of the matter is that if we had enough trees, the burning of the fossil fuels wouldn't be a problem, because those trees would take in that carbon dioxide and convert it to oxygen. The problem is that we've cut down so many trees that we don't have enough trees to consume all that carbon in the air. And so we have to try to put less in the air so that the trees that we do have left can kind of recycle that into oxygen. So they are a major food source for all marine animals because you'll typically find them in the water. They are also potential biofuel. Have you guys heard of biofuel before? Anybody heard of biofuel? Probably know what fossil fuels are. Fossil fuels are what they find underneath the ground after organisms have died for billions of years. Biofuel is different. Biofuel is made from living things. So it's an actual form of gas or fuel. And you'll find it if you've ever been to a gas station or if you have a car. I know some of you are a little bit older, so you may even have a car. But when you go to the gas station, you'll read on the label, it says like 10% ethanol. Anybody ever heard that before or seen that before? Give me a thumbs up if you've seen that or heard that before. It says 10% ethanol. That is a biofuel that is made from corn. And so they figured out how to use corn to create this fuel. Unfortunately, it made corn prices higher because there was less of it because they're using so much of it to make that fuel. It can be a good thing. It can be a bad thing. It just depends. Some products cannot handle ethanol, so you have to get non-ethanol gas, and that's typically going to be in like your ATVs, some lawnmowers, things like that. You have to get it without the ethanol because it doesn't work for everything. But for our vehicles, it was a good substitution because it means we need less fossil fuels. All right, so now let's check. I want you guys in the chat box to tell me, how are protists different than plants? How are protists different than plants? And I want to hear from everybody. I'm moving the chat box to just me. Put it in the chat box. We've talked about a number of ways that protists are different than plants. Put it in the chat box. Tell me one way that protists are different than plants. That's right, Aiden. Good. Come on, everybody. I want to hear from everybody. I need to see green dots next to everybody's name. Good, Braylon. Good, Zia. Which one, Zia? Which one have those? Come on, Chelsea, Dakota, Emily, Dean, Craven, Malachi, Ruben, Noah, Travis, Aiden, Kevin, Kenna, Wyatt, Claire, Emma, Ethan, I need to know that we're able to move on. That's right, Juju. They can have only one cell. That's right. That's right, Autumn. Plants are made of many cells. Clarify that statement, Jackson. What do you mean by that? Yes, Emma, their structures are totally different. Different tissues. Good, Dakota. Right. So a plant would have tissues, whereas a protist would just be a cell. That's right. The way they eat. That's right, Claire. Because plants are only going to be autotrophic, whereas protists are going to be autotrophic and heterotrophic, meaning they can either eat other organisms or they can make their own food depending on what kind they are. All right, good. So not everybody answered. I'm hoping everybody's paying attention and not playing Roblox or watching TikTok on your phone. All right, so we're moving over to fungi. So fungi, they can be microscopic. There's a few of them that are microscopic. For the most part, though, you can see them with your eyes. Okay. Mold would be more of the microscopic category. When you look at a wall and you see mold on a wall, the reason you can see it is because that's a lot of mold particles kind of living together in a colony. Whereas yeast and mushrooms, you can definitely see those with your eyes. We have any bakers in here that are familiar with yeast? You've ever seen yeast before or held it in your hand? Kind of almost looks like a little tiny seed. It's small, but you can definitely see it with your eyes. Yeast is really cool to play with. I mean, you can do a lot of fun stuff with yeast. It's got some really crazy abilities. But they are unicellular, okay? Mold are going to be multicellular. And then mushrooms are going to be multicellular. So toadstools, spore-bearing, fruiting bodies, all these different kinds of mushrooms. Yeah, it is cool, Zia, because it makes the dough rise. So that's what it does is it creates gases. It has like chemical reactions with what you put in the bread. And it causes gases to be released, and that's what makes the bread rise. So yeast has some pretty cool elephant. Has anybody ever seen elephant paste? Oh, we should do that lab. That would be fun. Anybody ever made elephant toothpaste before? No? Okay. You'll have to watch a video on it. I'll see if I can find a video on it for next time. But elephant toothpaste is the best. You put like a couple of things inside a container and it goes whoosh. It makes all this foam. And so you can do that with yeast. That's one of the products that you use in that. All right, so what are fungi? Yeah, oh, does he? Okay, I'll look it up, Raylon. I know Science Max too, I think has a really good one. So fungi are a unique, yeah, they're fun people. What did the mushroom say? You guys should know this joke by now. What did the mushroom say to the frog? What did the frog say to the mushroom? Sorry, backwards. What did the frog say to the mushroom? Don't know. You're a fun guy. The frog said to the mushroom, you're a fun guy. I know. Us science people have terrible jokes. I'm sorry. All right. So what are fungi? They're a unique kingdom of living organisms, not plants, not animals, not protists. They can be molds, they can be mushrooms, they can be yeast. But no matter what, they are part of the eukaryotic category. So that means that their cells have all those membrane-bound organelles in them, okay? Let's compare that to what we learned yesterday. Bacteria, remember, very simple structure, doesn't have a lot of stuff in it. It's got this DNA. It's got these ribosomes in the cytoplasm, but that's about it. The fungal cell kind of has a funny shape to it. It can bud off, and that's kind of how it reproduces. Creates a little bud on the end, and then that will become a new cell. But for the most part, it looks just like a plant cell or an animal cell. It's got the same stuff in it. You got the Golgi apparatus, you've got your nucleus, you've got your mitochondria, you got your ribosomes, cytoplasm, all that good stuff. Okay, so this is a eukaryotic cell. This is a prokaryotic cell. Prokaryotic cells are very simple. Eukaryotic cells are more complex. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. Prokaryotic cells do not. All right, so fungi are mostly multicellular, meaning they're made of more than one cell, so you can see them with your eyes. The only ones that are not are yeast. Yeast is going to be the only one that's unicellular, but you can still see it even though it's unicellular. They have cell walls, which makes them similar to plants. Remember, plant cells have cell walls that give them structure, okay? But they're made of a different material called chitin. There's different forms. They're different from plants, which use cellulose. So their cell walls are going to be made of cellulose, whereas fungi are going to be made of chitin. Chitin can also be found in some insect exoskeletons. So if you think of like a ladybug, for example, they have their skeleton kind of on the outside. They've got that coating on the outside of them. That's an exoskeleton. So they're going to be made of the same material as fungal cells. So there's a lot of similarities and differences between the kingdoms, and that's kind of what classifies things in different kingdoms based on whether they move, what they're made out of, their photosynthetic or heterotrophic abilities. That kind of determines which kingdom they're going to be living in. So here's an example of a fungal mold. Here's a yeast, and then here's a mushroom. Where do they live? They typically live in every environment, okay? So all over the place. They thrive in terrestrial habitats, which are in warmer, moister environments. Some can live in aquatic settings, so in the water. They're most commonly found in soil and dead organic matter because these guys are also decomposers. Everybody should, at this point, know what a decomposer is. What is a decomposer? Table 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What is a decomposer? Put it in the chat box or pick up your mic and tell me. What is a decomposer? Yes, Zia. Come on, I know more than Zia knows this. What is a decomposer? What does it do?
A scavenger of sorts.
Okay, explain a little further. What does it do?
Eats dead things.
Yes. Okay, very good. So it breaks down dead organisms and it replenishes the soil with the nutrients from that organism. So that is what a fungus is. It's, Protist did the same thing. If it's a fungus like Protist, then it's doing the same thing. But fungi, for the most part, that's all they do, is they break down dead stuff. So whenever you see a mushroom or one of these other types of things, they're breaking down whatever it is that they're on. That's the reason why they're on there. So you'll typically see the bigger mushrooms like with feces, any kind of droppings or, animal poop or stuff like that. it still needs to be broken down further. And so that's the job of the mushroom. The mushroom is to break that down and get rid of it. You know, if we didn't have mushrooms, we would have dead things all over your yard. All right. We don't want dead things all over our yard. We want them to break down. We want those nutrients to go back in the soil so that we can grow some new plants. This is a fun picture over here. I'm sure all of you have seen bread mold before. All right, so they break down those dead organisms. They return those critical nutrients back into the soil. Even when you take your bread and it's got that bread mold and then you throw it in the trash, it's going to go to a landfill where it's going to continue to break down, and then those nutrients are either going to be made into natural gas or they're going to be replenished in that soil. So it's kind of better to compost. Does anybody know what composting is? Anybody ever heard of composting before? Yeah, what is it? What is it, Zia?
Breaking down things to make fertilizer.
Yeah, so you get like a bucket, okay, or a garbage can, and you just throw all of your plant material, your bread material, anything like that. Not typically meat, you wouldn't want to do that, but any kind of plant or bread material, you throw that in the bucket, and then you can throw some earthworms in there, and it'll turn into soil, like really good soil. So keep that in mind if you ever want to, you know, get serious about taking care of the environment. It's much better than throwing it in the trash because, you know, you want those nutrients to get back into the soil. All right, so last reflection question. I want to hear from everybody in the chat box. What would the world look like without fungi? What would the world look like without fungi? I see a couple of people so awake. Yeah, definitely not as green. Good. Lots of dead plants, lots of dead animals all over your yard. You'd be walking through, because you know how many dead animals die in your yard? Tons. But they're carried away by scavengers. And then wherever their bones remain or whatever is remaining on the bones, that kind of goes into the soil after it's been decomposed. Yep, bunch of dead things around for sure. All right, any questions before we end? Do not have an exit ticket for you today. We were supposed to do a near pod, but go ahead.